Chapter 9, Part 1. Slavery. The catalyst of slavery. One of the most morally troubling aspects of the Bible, and indeed many ancient texts, is their inclusion of prescriptions concerning slavery. Slavery is an institution for which no justification can ever be acceptable or desirable. Even if we step outside the theistic framework and imagine the creation of an acceptable God for skeptics, we are left to grapple with the historical silence on this issue. All major religious traditions and foundational texts acknowledge slavery to some degree, yet none explicitly condemn or prohibit it. This compels us to examine the historical and social forces that might have influenced these omissions, and to seek a rational understanding of their underlying motives. To understand the roots of slavery, we must first dispel a common misconception. Slavery's origins were not inherently tied to racial prejudice. In its earliest forms, slavery emerged within family and tribal structures. Those who violated community norms or posed a threat to their group were often enslaved as a form of punishment or neutralization. Initially, this practice was confined to members of one's own tribe or community. As societies expanded and internal conflicts gave way to wars with external enemies, slavery evolved into a widespread institution. Captives were no longer seen merely as threats to be neutralized or as incidental outcomes of conflict. Instead, they became deliberate targets, valued as resources to be systematically exploited. This shift marked the beginning of large-scale raids and the organized enslavement of people for economic gain. Despite its material benefits to enslavers, slavery faced a fundamental challenge: the natural human inclination toward empathy. In the absence of immediate danger, enslavers often began to identify with their slaves, leading to sympathy and feelings of shared humanity. This empathy created moral dissonance, undermining the stability of the newly established institution. To suppress these inconvenient emotions, societies developed ideological constructs to dehumanize the enslaved. Caste systems, depersonalization, and even demonization were employed to create an artificial sense of separation. Slaves were portrayed as inherently inferior, subhuman, or morally corrupt, justifying their subjugation. This dehumanization served as a compromise between the pursuit of economic gain and the need for psychological peace among enslavers. It is important to recognize that humans rarely engage in harmful practices purely for the sake of harm itself. For example, consider laws on capital punishment or life imprisonment, complete with detailed procedures and conditions. An outsider unfamiliar with the broader societal context might mistakenly conclude that these punishments are celebrated as virtues. Such a misunderstanding arises only by ignoring the intent behind these practices: to serve justice, deter harm, or protect society. Similarly, contemporary generations often misjudge the actions of previous ones, particularly regarding practices like slavery. Those who participated in slavery often considered themselves noble and morally upright, acting within the ethical frameworks of their time. Likewise, future generations may view our current practices, such as the widespread exploitation of animal species, as barbaric. What we deem reasonable today may one day be seen as morally indefensible as our understanding of ethics evolves. The emergence of slavery is deeply tied to humanity's early struggle for survival. In the primitive world, the priority was not global human welfare, but survival in the face of scarcity. Neighboring tribes were seen not only as competitors for resources, but as existential threats. In this context, slavery can be viewed as a more humane alternative to annihilation. Rather than destroying a defeated tribe, societies used captives as a resource. In many cases, the vanquished considered enslavement preferable to extinction, finding relief in survival. Exceptions to this preference emerged with the rise of specific ideologies. In larger, more established tribes where annihilation by enemies was less imminent, cultural narratives began to glorify honor, principle, patriotism, and self-sacrifice, partly to avoid the economic or military reinforcement of competitors through captives. These ideologies encouraged a willingness to choose death over the humiliation of slavery. However, even within such ideological frameworks, survival instincts often prevailed, leading individuals to choose slavery over death when faced with the option. In the early period of tribal social structures, slavery existed in a form distinct from the images it conjures today. Captives who became slaves were tasked with performing labor that had previously been the responsibility of tribe members themselves. These slaves often worked alongside the lower strata of the tribe, living under similar conditions. Broadly speaking, this arrangement was not entirely unlike the modern integration of refugees into a society where, for example, a farmer who once picked their own strawberries might now employ a seasonal migrant worker. These workers, while technically free, often face limited opportunities and earn far less annually than the farmer who hires them. In many languages, the word work shares etymological roots with terms for slavery. The distinction today lies in the mechanisms of compulsion. Modern individuals are not enslaved by force of arms but by systemic factors such as limited access to free land, scarce resources, or simply by advertisement. As Marcus Tullius Cicero aptly observed, anyone who gives their labor for money sells themselves and reduces themselves to the position of a slave. While modern refugees leave their homes voluntarily, their decisions are often dictated by external pressures, economic hardship, political conflict, or natural disasters. These factors render continued existence in their native environments untenable. A similar dynamic applied to defeated peoples in the primitive era. Their communities were destroyed, and their property and resources were seized. In modern terms, this could be likened to collecting reparations or compensation for damages and the costs of military actions, justified by the perceived or real threat posed by the defeated peoples. In many cases, this threat was not merely imagined, but reflected genuine conflicts of interest over resources and survival. Then, as now, wars were driven not only by the pursuit of national prosperity, but also by the desire to eliminate dangerous neighbors who posed existential or economic threats. This underscores that the practice of waging war under any pretext represents an even more primitive stage of social development than slavery itself, and should be considered an inherently immoral phenomenon. The only distinction between the two lies in their outcomes. In one case, people are enslaved for economic stability. In the other, they are killed. The reasoning behind this assertion is complex and would require a comprehensive exploration to outline the necessity of a gradual shift toward pacifism. As Heraclitus of Ephesus famously remarked, "War is the father of all. It has made some gods, others humans, some slaves, and others free." Even a war against slavery, despite its noble goals, invites critical and philosophical scrutiny. Consider this paradoxical example. In countries where slavery persisted far longer than in the United States, due to unique historical circumstances and isolation from anti-slavery narratives, the population often does not grapple with the lingering post-slavery turbulence. Such societies may, paradoxically, exhibit less collective suffering, having transitioned through a seemingly less noble path. Furthermore, if we were to construct a hypothetical scale to quantify both mental and physical suffering, much like we calculate material damage, we might find that the cumulative suffering during the American Civil War, with its bloody battles and profound societal divisions, outweighed that of societies where slavery dissolved gradually without revolution. Similarly, within the United States itself, one might argue that if slavery had ended through gradual economic shifts rather than violent conflict, the overall level of suffering might have been less severe. However, we must set aside this hypothesis, as modern society, paradoxically, evaluates events predominantly through social principles rather than by comparing the aggregate levels of suffering. Interestingly, the origins of the Civil War in the United States can be traced to economic transformations that acted as a catalyst for moral renewal within several Protestant denominations. Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Baptists all experienced a heightened drive to address and eradicate social vices. This movement was deeply intertwined with eschatological expectations, as believers sought to purify society in preparation for Christ's anticipated second coming. They interpreted the increase in societal idleness, luxury, and indulgent living, which aligned with certain biblical prophecies, as signs of this approaching event. Special attention was given to slavery as one of the most egregious forms of social injustice. Certain passages in the New Testament, such as Jesus' declaration, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword," Matthew 10:34, were interpreted literally by some as a call to armed struggle in pursuit of justice through the Christian mission. However, the changing attitudes towards slavery in various societies were largely an inevitable consequence of economic and social progress, accelerating as prosperity increased. Economic progress proved to be a decisive factor in mitigating many barbaric practices rooted in the struggle for survival and resources. The stronger the economic position of a state or an individual owner, the better the conditions became for slaves. This phenomenon can be understood through the lens of economic theory and the historical development of productive forces. In the context of limited resources and primitive technologies in the ancient world, slavery emerged as an efficient means of maximizing production. With few alternatives available, enslaving others provided a solution to labor shortages and enabled the exploitation of resources on a larger scale. However, as agricultural methods improved, crafts advanced, and trade networks expanded, the economic viability of slavery began to decline. Free labor proved to be more productive, especially in industries that required skill, creativity, and initiative qualities. Even within the confines of a slave-owning system, economic growth often led to better conditions for slaves. As owners accumulated wealth, they could afford to treat slaves as valuable assets rather than expendable tools. Improved treatment, in turn, increased productivity, creating a feedback loop in which economic prosperity reduced the harshness of slavery. This dynamic reveals a striking paradox. A system built on exploitation carried within it the seeds of its own eventual abolition. The very economic progress that slavery helped stimulate created conditions in which it became increasingly inefficient and ultimately untenable. The condemnation of slavery, however, is rooted in our capacity for empathy, the ability to relate to others by viewing ourselves and them through the prism of basic human needs, the desire to avoid suffering and the wish to experience pleasure. Upon this foundation, we construct our notion of values. Yet this sentiment is strongest when we ourselves are in comfortable conditions. When we find ourselves among those who lack the means to meet basic needs, or when alleviating others' suffering threatens to cause suffering for us, moral judgment becomes influenced by the instinct to escape a situation of shared constraints. Let us examine both contemporary and ancient societies through an abstract example by imagining two hypothetical groups of people. In the first group, resources are so scarce that their equal distribution results in the lowest possible level of suffering for all its members. However, unequal distribution allows some individuals to experience pleasure and comfort, albeit at the cost of increasing the suffering of others. This situation is more likely to provoke a struggle for dominance, as individuals compete for access to resources and seek to accumulate them. The aim of such accumulation might be to redistribute resources among the needy, ensuring they are satisfied and do not threaten the dominant member's position, ideally freeing up the latter's time and mental energy to create better living conditions. In the second group, resources are abundant enough that their distribution not only minimizes suffering, but also maximizes the pleasure of all its members. Naturally, this group is less inclined to engage in resource conflicts, as such disputes could risk isolation and are unnecessary when everyone's basic needs and more are already met. From an external perspective, this group may appear more humane and civilized. However, this perception is not rooted in their values, but rather in the abundance of their resources. In his work Politics, Aristotle asserted that society requires a class of individuals engaged in physical labor to enable others to pursue politics, philosophy, and the sciences. However, Aristotle also recognized the inherent equality of humans as beings and argued that the conditions of workers should improve as circumstances allow. If every tool, when summoned, or even of its own accord, could do the work that befits it, then there would be no need either of apprentices for the master workers or of slaves for the lords. An analysis of historical processes reveals that the so-called abolition of slavery was, in fact, a transformation of slavery shaped by the evolution of economic systems. This pattern can be observed across various societies. Tribes that were geographically isolated or did not engage in large-scale military conflicts were among the first to improve labor conditions. The lack of an influx of prisoners of war, coupled with economic growth, facilitated this development. In societies where economic growth was accompanied by territorial expansion, labor conditions initially improved for members of their own community. However, the recognition of universal equality and the right to equal opportunities developed much more slowly, emerging only as the sense of external threat diminished. This progress is so slow that I still cannot obtain refugee status because of the nationality listed in my passport. Over time, the economic advantages of improving workers' lives became increasingly evident. Letting them spend on their own homes, worry about their sustenance, and even choose their employer proved to be more profitable in the long term. Yet, this process remains far from complete. A true measure of progress would involve equal investment by the USA in both its own economy and the economies of Middle Eastern countries, or the equitable distribution of resources across all nations, even when such actions conflict with short-term national interests. This point is particularly relevant considering the economic advancement of former colonial powers, which relied heavily on resources from Asia, the human labor of Africa, and intellectual contributions borrowed from around the world. Ultimately, the complete eradication of slavery depends on the development of global empathy, where the well-being of others takes precedence over personal or national gain on a planetary scale. In reality, the principle of slavery remains intact. We still see lackeys, housemaids, and service personnel whose lives are often reduced to earning just enough to cover basic necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter. Meanwhile, there is the charming phenomenon of exclusive establishments and recreational spots, where luxury goods are reserved for the elite, while more modest offerings are left for the masses. To be fair, these disparities become less pronounced in more prosperous economies. Fast forward to a future where humanity has fully robotized all services. The new generation will undoubtedly recoil in horror at the realization that we once employed fellow humans, our equals no less, for menial work. We robbed them of significant portions of their lives, compromised their health, subjected them to stress, and most appallingly, profited from their labor. Future critics will likely argue that even if economic growth was the goal, humane conditions should have required the equitable distribution of 100% of income among all team members. Operational maintenance and expansion funds, they might insist, should have been allocated only with the unanimous consent of all employees, couriers included. The housemaid scenario is no exception. A just approach would require integrating such a worker into the family's income distribution system on equal terms with other family members. Those unwilling to adopt this model should either reconcile themselves to having less personal free time or roll up their sleeves and take on the work themselves if they wish to evade moral accountability. From an evolutionary perspective, we might excuse our ancestors and resist the urge to purge Stone Age exhibits from museums on the grounds of their so-called misogyny. However, the issue becomes infinitely more complex when we consider a worldview that includes a creator who purportedly fashioned humanity in a state of perfection. If that were true, how did we fall from such an exalted intellectual state into barbarism, only to climb back again? And why did God not provide us with a golden standard of behavior and an ideal society? Such a standard, even if it could not have prevented human degradation during times of scarcity, could at least have been revered by future civilizations as a paragon of moral perfection. A helpless God. Declaring an outright ban on any form of slavery would not have guaranteed its eradication. This is exemplified by the prophet Nehemiah's reproaches in chapter 5, where he condemns Israelite slave owners for disregarding the abolition of slavery, even during the composition of the Old Testament. Historical records further corroborate this, as Max J. Kohler highlights in his article Anti-Slavery Movement and the Jews in the Jewish Encyclopedia, 1901. Moreover, the persistence of such practices among neighboring tribes would have had a predictable impact. Imagine a tribe strictly adhering to divine covenants, surrounded by neighbors living under traditional laws. The consequences of such adherence would likely have been both severe and foreseeable. The tribe might face demographic decline due to the lack of new members and the departure of its more ambitious individuals. Economic and military setbacks caused by these restrictions would render the tribe politically vulnerable. Even if it managed to avoid absorption by its neighbors, it would still face a critical dilemma: to abandon the God whose commandments seem to hinder prosperity, or to distort the original teachings for the sake of survival. The question arises, why would God not intervene supernaturally to provide resources rather than tolerating slavery as an economic stabilizer? After all, he is described as a deity capable of performing miracles, such as commanding fields to lie fallow every 7 years while promising abundant harvests in prior years. Surely, such a God should intervene where necessary. To address this fundamental criticism, we must return to the thesis framework of cause and effect relationships. In the ideal model of God we are considering, one characterized by absolute logic and absolute compassion, he cannot desire the destruction of any personality. At the same time, he cannot forcibly compel people to live according to the laws of happiness. A person must consciously, or at least intuitively, choose to pursue this path. After all, measures that provoke the recognition of facts, no matter how irrefutable, do not guarantee a genuine desire or agreement with them. Additionally, we must account for the dynamics of autonomous reality, where the balance of forces in the brain has started to favor the limbic system 2-1. This means that emotional impulses often override rational arguments, making reason secondary for most individuals. Given this, it is more compassionate not to force people into conformity, but to allow them to live according to their own understanding of good. Consequently, those whose personal beliefs align most closely with the real idea of the common good are less likely to suffer in an ideal world. Perfect love by its nature cannot allow unnecessary suffering. Under these initial conditions, we find ourselves in a reality where a personality-desiring antinomy can exist, granted maximum autonomy within the physical world. However, since separation from the all-encompassing God equates to non-existence, which contradicts the goal of preserving personalities, God continues to encompass everything within himself. Yet, he allows for the negation of his presence, as some parts of creation may desire, by refraining from direct interference in the processes that distort the original norms. The exception to this is grace, which does not directly interfere with entropic processes but instead regenerates life through the circulation of energy on the physical level. This mechanism avoids foreseeable interference and preserves autonomy. Additionally, God could have implemented an autopilot program throughout creation to combat death and non-existence at all costs, thereby preventing the rapid extinction of the environment necessary for the rebellious personality's existence. Despite all this, to save the maximum number of personalities, it is essential to convey information that enables them to choose initial patterns. The challenge lies in delivering this information in a way that does not compromise their sense of autonomy, ensuring they remain the gods of their own universe, even if this universe exists within God. However, when a personality begins to seek these patterns on its own initiative, driven solely by intuition, the possibility arises for more direct contact. This contact, however, must remain limited to a degree that still allows for the choice of an alternative way of life, even in the presence of information about these patterns. The right to an alternative is the defining quality that makes a personality truly a personality. It is a condition that must be upheld even in eternity. Furthermore, this freedom is the only thing that gives the concept of deity a personal quality, preventing God from becoming a lifeless, programmatic mechanism akin to the autopilot of creation's survival. A similar idea can be found in the Bible itself, where God demonstrates that he can intervene in human life and even act through a person without their consent. This is exemplified in the episode where Saul, while pursuing David through the mountains and villages with a detachment, suddenly finds himself among a group of prophets in the city of Ramah. There, he begins to prophesy alongside them. Having played the role of a puppet, Saul eventually returns to his detachment and resumes the pursuit. However, the Bible presents a seemingly contradictory statement regarding Saul's interactions with Samuel. Chronologically, after the events in chapter 15, it is written, "And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death." Yet in chapter 19, Saul is described as prophesying in Samuel's presence. And he too prophesied before Samuel. 1 Samuel 19:24. These accounts suggest that while Saul's physical body, his biological shell, was present and prophesying under the influence of the Spirit of God, his conscious mind and personality were absent. This illustrates that when God overrides a person's will and desires, they lose self-awareness and cease to be themselves. The idea that God refrains from altering human desires to preserve personality is also poetically depicted in the Song of Songs. In this image, God, represented as a bridegroom, places his hand through the keyhole of a door. He demonstrates that he could open the door from within but chooses not to, stepping back to allow the individual to open the door themselves. This act signifies not just opening the door, but actively seeking God and desiring these patterns of behavior. Accordingly, God can intervene in physical processes, but only in the most localized manner and exclusively in a proportion that preserves the balance of information between the alternative and the patterns of objective good. If someone attempts to destroy the tools used to spread information capable of saving the maximum number of people, a compromise is made. The moment when God is forced to become part of sin, personally pulling the lever to switch the tracks of the trolley, as described in the Bible, is portrayed as a deeply painful process that bloodied and scarred God's hands. As for miracles, supernatural interventions, both conditions must be met for them to occur. Agreement with God's will, more specifically, the individual's consent to the miracle akin to allowing themselves to be used as gloves in a uranium laboratory, and the exceptional necessity of preserving the balance of positive, saving information. In other chapters, we have thoroughly examined why a life dominated by the prevalence and clarity of positive information, suppressing the ability to choose an alternative while still technically allowing its possibility, would inevitably turn life into mental torment for the majority. Imagine a casino bathed in light from a radiant, sorrowful face shining through its roof, or the realization that the burnt coffee, without which someone cannot imagine life, slowly harms a body that, as it turns out, has an engineer, an unexpected revelation in itself. Yourself, your happiness, and your world would be crushed by the realization that there is a God who disgusts you, that your values have been declared harmful, and that you are predestined to lose and face doom while someone else lives forever. In such a reality, the sense of personal freedom and ownership over oneself would become unattainable. Various methods of dulling consciousness and escaping reality would pale in comparison to suicide, which might appear as the ultimate expression of complete autonomy and liberation from the oppressive weight of existence. However, God desires even those who have rejected Him to experience moments of happiness. Happiness rooted in feelings of righteousness, agreement, and support from others. A sense of being needed, useful, or significant, and even a distorted sense of superiority, which reflects a flawed facet of the aspiration toward perfection. The issue lies in the fact that striving to destroy the original patterns ultimately leads to fragmentation into non-existence. God has ensured that even in pursuing death, a personality can experience the maximum possible taste of life within this contradictory process. The conditions of agreement with God's will and the necessity of preserving information can explain the peculiar depiction of God in the Bible. In its narrative, God performs miracles yet paradoxically commands adherence to hygiene practices instead of eradicating all bacteria. He provides a gradation of minimally harmful meats, from herbivores to grasshoppers, alongside a list of dangerous ones, rather than purifying even rotten meat through the prayers of the faithful or deploying Christians as the planet's sanitarians. Alternatively, God could have created a state of paradisiacal abundance, eliminating the need for meat altogether, even before the agricultural revolution of the mid-19th century. However, the fact that God led a tribe of informants to Canaan instead of turning the desert into a garden of plenty suggests that He operates within the constraints of resource competition. He breaks these constraints only when absolutely necessary to preserve information. As this information spreads and the two options, alignment with God's patterns or choosing an alternative, stabilize, intervention becomes necessary only in exceptional cases. These cases arise when the contrast created by the entropic processes of society overshadows common sense. In such moments, intervention primarily occurs through the activity of individuals who allow themselves to be inspired to act or through what might appear as mere coincidence. Within this thesis framework, the answer to why God intervenes only minimally, such as once every 7 years, lies in the nature of those interventions. They align with simple patterns like the agricultural cycle, soil mineralization, or as the Bible describes it, the practice of lying fallow, which helps maintain soil fertility with minimal disruption. This can also explain the promise of an abundant harvest, expressed in primitive language and framed with motivations that resonated with the people of that time. Much like the promise of longevity for those who honor their father and mother, a longevity that arises naturally from setting an example for their own children and fostering positive relationships rooted in mutual care. This principle aligns with the traditions of ancestor worship in Japan, where care for the elderly has been elevated to a national priority, particularly after the revival of once-suppressed traditions in the post-1945 era, when the average life expectancy rose dramatically from 50 to 85 years. Transitioning from the concept of a helpless God back to the issue of slavery, we can assume that God could neither prevent the distortion of a direct prohibition nor avoid the likelihood of an uprising among the people as evidenced by the rebellion of Korah, Numbers 16:30. However, God has always punished the distortion of information with extreme severity, which raises the question of why he did not apply the same approach to the information regarding the inadmissibility of slavery. Why not eliminate dissenters, as he did before the Israelites entered Canaan, and begin anew with reasonable and unambitious individuals? A seemingly plausible solution that, nonetheless, would inevitably lead to the same outcome. Eventually, new followers from other cultures lacking the fervor and zeal of the Jews, whose numbers would likely dwindle due to the repeated purges by such a God, would have greater incentives to reinterpret the prohibition differently, particularly in the context of the ubiquitous practice of slavery and limited economic conditions. And even under the most optimistic circumstances, they might circumvent the prohibition by instituting symbolic payments to slaves, allowing them to purchase food, clothing, and pay rent. Ultimately, one could simply create an abridged version of the Bible, as English slave owners did for their slaves, deliberately excluding numerous verses that could lead to conclusions undermining the institution of slavery. Imagine yourself in the role of a deity faced with a profound dilemma. On one hand, the risk of losing your last collaborators. On the other, the unavoidable reality of slavery's existence within society. In such circumstances, it would seem more reasonable to establish laws regulating this practice to minimize cruelty. Now consider addressing humanity in the 21st century as a deity. Would you boldly declare, any work driven by necessity or lack of prosperity is evil and must be abolished? Henceforth, labor should be performed solely out of altruistic motives. To eliminate labor motivated by basic human needs, all resources should be evenly distributed among everyone, ensuring universal well-being and fostering conditions for voluntary labor and social progress. This vision, entirely feasible and contingent only on human will, might inspire future generations to admire its elevated moral standard. However, the present generation would likely respond differently. At best, they would dismiss it as an unattainable ideal, citing the insurmountable challenges of restructuring the global economy and bridging ideological divides. At worst, you would be branded an enemy of humanity. Alternatively, if you, as God, prescribed practical regulations, such as guidelines for dismissal, fines, and employer obligations, this would not imply indifference to labor inspired by altruism or enthusiasm. Nor would it suggest that you condone labor performed under the lash. For example, God was against divorce and declared, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." This principle is further affirmed in Malachi 2:16. For the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce. However, the clever but morally compromised individuals of the barbaric period chose not to violate the law outright, but instead led their wives into the desert, where unforeseen natural causes would ensure their demise, conveniently allowing for remarriage. To prevent such abuses, God introduced regulations for divorce, just as he did for polygamy. These measures aim to mitigate worse outcomes, such as the dire fate of a wife in harsh conditions following the probable death of her husband in battle or from disease. God desires none of these practices and considers them inherently evil, yet he is compelled to choose the lesser evil, metaphorically pressing the trolley lever repeatedly. The ideal concept of society, as envisioned in the New Testament, is one where everyone enjoys equal rights and opportunities. In this model, resources were shared within a framework of common values and unified purpose. A slave had access to as many resources as his master, and Christ's teachings emphasized esteeming others higher than oneself. This radical reimagining of societal norms emerged through Christ's parables and statements, which subverted deeply ingrained stereotypes. His teachings resonate with a sentiment famously expressed during the French Revolution. Leadership is the act of turning oneself into voluntary slavery for the sake of those you lead, a concept reflected in Luke 17:7-10. Similar ideas have been echoed by figures like Nelson Mandela, Albert Einstein, Franklin Roosevelt, and numerous other reformers of modern civilization. In the context of ancient Jewish society where labor acquisition and military conflicts were common, the idea of equal distribution of property and rights between the indigenous population and captured or purchased foreigners posed significant challenges. This was particularly problematic when dealing with individuals who were hostile to the tribe or did not share its values, as such a policy could lead to disastrous consequences. A modern parallel might be the adoption of a law that abolishes the persecution of spies or individuals seeking to undermine the constitutional order. Taking it a step further, if such individuals were granted shares in the distribution of income from large corporations as an incentive to transform them into loyal citizens, the stability of the state could be seriously compromised. Interestingly, there is a biblical precedent suggesting that a slave could integrate into the tribe if they ceased their hostility or began to adopt its worldview. This idea is reflected in the verse Deuteronomy 21:14. And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. But thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. The Hebrew word inita used in this verse comes from the root anah, which often conveys meanings such as to be occupied, to be busied with, to humble, to be bowed down, or to be subdued. In biblical contexts, anah most commonly refers to bringing someone to humility or a state of obedience and, admittedly, at times, through subjugation. Anticipating a sense of revulsion, I note that below, we will discuss laws regarding legal marriage, which often involved a single woman whom the groom's parents were expected to treat as their own daughter. The divorce provisions were on equal terms with fellow tribespeople. To prevent misunderstandings among the less civilized, God stipulated that a woman who, due to inevitable circumstances, found herself in slavery but was honored with marriage could not be reduced to slave status again. This was because she had already demonstrated humility and loyalty to the tribe by entering into marriage. Additionally, any abuse or intimacy outside marriage was punishable by death, according to the law. It can be assumed that the criterion for freedom was loyalty, which made a person safe for society. This interpretation fits into the context and is suitable for our rational concept of God. The result of such regulatory norms was that people who were previously enslaved by Israeli tribes eventually integrated into society and became full-fledged members of the tribal community. As for the modern perception of what is written, the calculation was probably made on analytical capabilities in the context of a wide range of information, knowledge of psychology and experience, forecasting the consequences of alternative scenarios. To a modern analyst, it is evident that, in addition to explicit regulatory norms, the Bible contains numerous implicit ideas advocating not only for equality, but also for the eventual abolition of slavery. These concepts can be interpreted as dormant directives, waiting for the right economic and social conditions to emerge for their full implementation. Similarly, other biblical principles, such as vegetarianism, veganism, pacifism, altruism, and even the abolition of monetary systems, could be seen as awaiting their realization in a more advanced and civilized society. For now, however, let us focus on specific passages of Scripture that lead to clear conclusions. Slavery is wrong, oppression is wrong, and any form of suffering is also wrong. Whoever sheds human blood by humans, let his blood be shed, because God made humans in his image reflecting God's very nature. Genesis 9:6-7, and Genesis 1:27. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. James 3:9. For there is no partiality with God. Romans 2:11. The man of wealth and the poor man come face to face. The Lord is the maker of them all. Proverbs 22:2. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Exodus 23:9. Let me remind you that in Egypt they were slaves. Who shows no partiality nor takes a bribe. He administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Deuteronomy 10:17-19. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. 1 Corinthians 12:13. Fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Philippians 2:1-5. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. Titus 2:11-12. I charge you, in the sight of God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels, to keep these instructions without partiality, and to do nothing out of favoritism. 1 Timothy 5:21. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. Colossians 4:1. And ye masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. Ephesians 6:9. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. Galatians 5:13. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. 1 Corinthians 7:21. This topic is also addressed in many other passages. In conclusion, the Apostle Paul's epistle to Philemon provides valuable insight into the biblical perspective on slavery. In this letter, Paul, aware of Roman laws restricting the release of slaves, such as the prohibition of manumitting slaves before a certain length of service, and limiting the number of freed slaves to no more than 1/10 per owner to prevent rebellion or destabilization of the system, returns the runaway slave Onesimus to his master Philemon. However, Paul makes an extraordinary request. He urges Philemon to accept Onesimus not as a slave, but as a beloved brother in Christ, equal to a son. Moreover, Paul asks Philemon to treat Onesimus with the same respect and honor he would show to Paul himself. This approach builds upon the earlier abolition of debt slavery in the Old Testament, where such servitude was initially limited to 6 years. This trajectory reflects a broader human evolutionary trend. As economies grew and stabilized, the duration of debt slavery prescribed by law tended to decrease. For instance, the Code of Hammurabi reduced the term of debt slavery to 3 years, and further economic expansion eventually led to its abolition altogether. According to the accounts of Josephus Flavius, many Israelite slaves preferred to remain in servitude, choosing the alternative option of financial rewards in addition to the stability of steady work and an established household over freedom. This is also reflected in the New Testament's exhortation: come out of slavery when such an opportunity arises, for you are called to freedom, highlighting the popularity of this option. Religious norms mandating kind and respectful treatment of slaves made servitude under such conditions an appealing choice. We also observe humbling calls directed at those who were denied the choice of freedom due to the strict Roman laws regulating the liberation of slaves. Even against the backdrop of Christ's clear teachings, his followers still owned slaves, constrained by these rigid legal frameworks. However, within the Christian community, the harshness of Roman law was tempered by a compassionate attitude toward those in servitude, balanced by warnings against rebellion, which inevitably led to violence and was fundamentally incompatible with Christ's teachings. This delicate equilibrium, adhering to the law while nurturing a spirit of compassion and equality, highlights the profound moral dilemmas faced by God. The image of a seemingly helpless God may arise from his boundless love for all creation, a love so encompassing that it necessitates moral compromises to preserve as many personalities as possible. This is vividly depicted as a God with bound hands, bloodied and distorted by the touch of sin, absorbing the entropy it generates. God not only endures this suffering within himself, but uses it as the only tool to protect the personalities who have chosen separation from him. The crucifixion serves as the ultimate symbol of this divine dilemma. The excruciating pain of necessary compromises is powerfully represented by the thorns piercing God's consciousness, embodying the agony of reconciling justice, love, and the preservation of free will along the path of transformation. For the continuation of this chapter, see the second part,